The scan that changed everything. It began on a morning that should have been peaceful. The sun rose slowly over the Indian Ocean, spilling golden light across Karachi's rooftops and the restless sea beyond. Amir stood on the weather tower, watching his instruments flicker as they always did at dawn, unaware that the readings before him were not caused by clouds or monsoon winds, but by something far beyond Earth's sky. Above the planet, hidden in the pale blue veil, a fleet of alien ships had arrived to measure a world they thought was primitive and weak. The Ashari Collective had conquered 12 worlds before this one, and their logic was cold. They did not destroy for sport, but for efficiency. They scanned, assessed, and harvested. To them, Earth was only another sphere to strip and another species to file away. When their scanners opened like giant metallic petals in orbit, they expected the calm whisper of a world barely awake. Instead, their systems screamed with noise. The readings were chaotic: ion bursts, radio flickers, heat signatures, even lightning patterns that carried structured interference. The alien technicians tried to smooth the data, assuming it was pollution, but the noise persisted. It was alive. Amir stared at the trembling dials of his console as they danced like possessed compasses. He tapped one, frowned, and then froze when the monitor wrote out a sentence it was not programmed to display. Signal mismatch. Atmospheric self-modulation detected. He tried calling Central Command, but all frequencies were clogged with static that hissed like whispers. Across the ocean in Manila, Dr. Mara Valdez had just begun her shift at a disaster clinic when the emergency radio came alive with overlapping voices. Pilots, sailors, storm chasers, all were reporting impossible patterns in the sky. Mara switched channels until she heard a transmission that made her blood run cold. It was not human. The voice was layered, metallic, and dismissive. To the inhabitants of this world, it said, "Your environment is primitive, your biology unstable. You are assessed as non-threat entities. Compliance is expected." Then silence. The message repeated twice more before vanishing. The world trembled, not from an attack, but from the realization that someone out there had judged humanity unworthy of fear. In orbit, the Ashari commanders argued among themselves. The lead analyst insisted that the planet's atmosphere was contaminated with unknown interference. Another claimed that human industry had corrupted its chemical balance. None of them understood that what they were reading was not pollution, it was persistence. For 200 years, humans had filled the air with their dreams, their wars, their radio songs, their signals bouncing endlessly across oceans and mountains. Even when they stopped transmitting, the echoes remained, trapped in layers of sky, rewriting tiny parts of the air's electrical behavior. When the Ashari scanned Earth, they were not just measuring oxygen and nitrogen. They were measuring the ghosts of every human shout, laugh, broadcast, and prayer that had ever escaped into the wind. Down on the ground, Amir finally managed to patch his small shortwave rig into an emergency loop and heard fragments from other survivors. London, Lagos, Lima, and Seoul all reported the same interference, all heard the same alien declaration. The governments hesitated, uncertain whether to fight or hide. Satellites went dark one by one as the fleet's suppressor nets wrapped around the planet. In those first hours, humanity seemed blind and small, but something strange was already happening. The static filling the skies was not random. It pulsed. It shifted frequencies in patterns that matched storm rhythms, as if the planet's own weather was learning. Amir, being a weatherman, noticed it first. The clouds above Karachi formed spirals that should have died but instead strengthened, guided by invisible hands of electricity. Mara noticed too when her hospital lights flickered in sync with the pulse she heard through the radio. Both of them felt the same truth rising in their chests. Earth was listening. In orbit, the alien admirals tried to correct their scans, but the data grew wilder. The air seemed to resist measurement. When they attempted to isolate one radio layer, another one flared up. When they blocked lightning, new storms formed elsewhere. The Ashari chief engineer finally snapped and declared that the planet's atmosphere was not natural. "It is hostile," he said in disbelief. "It is reacting to us." The commander dismissed the idea with a sneer. No world of savages could weaponize air. But even as he spoke, his ship's sensors picked up an anomaly near the equator, a heartbeat of electromagnetic pressure repeating every 12 seconds. It matched no human technology and no natural rhythm. It was Earth itself pulsing. Amir's instruments locked onto that same pattern. He recorded it, analyzed it, and realized it wasn't random. It was a signal, simple, deliberate, shaped like a warning. When he transmitted it across his network, other operators picked it up and echoed it forward. Within an hour, 1,000 stations from every continent repeated the pulse, turning human communication into a single synchronized beat. The aliens heard it too and grew uneasy. For the first time in their long history of conquest, a world they had not even attacked yet was answering back in its own voice. Mara looked up through the cracked hospital window at the restless sky glowing faintly red, and she whispered to herself what many others were beginning to think. They called us weak. They should have listened harder. Noise that thinks, the alien. Fleet hovered above Earth like a crown of dark silver moons, their scanners turning endlessly as they tried to understand the chaos below. The air burned with more than heat. It burned with intention. Every frequency they jammed came alive somewhere, else every silence they forced was filled again by another voice from another corner of the planet in the streets of Karachi. Amir barely slept. His tower had become a hive of volunteers, radio engineers, students, old mechanics. Everyone who could solder a wire or twist an antenna together came to help. They were not soldiers, but they had purpose. Their signal network spread through rooftops like veins through stone. Even without power grids, they made new ones. The world that had been quiet, for years now, buzzed like a single living machine across the ocean in Manila. Mara Valdez was working non-stop in her clinic. Wounded people came from the docks, burned by falling debris from a failed satellite. The air smelled of smoke, but every radio in the city was alive. Mara listened to voices speaking in dozens of languages, coordinating aid shipments, moving food across ruined streets. And somewhere among the noise, she caught the same pulse that Amir had found, the 12-second rhythm that had become Earth's heartbeat. It was steady, calm, and almost comforting, and she realized it was not a machine. It was people syncing together because they refused to be silenced. The aliens grew frustrated. Their data screens filled with unreadable waves. They sent drones to map the ground, but half of them failed to return. Those that did came back with corrupted recordings, images flickering between real cities and ghostly illusions, as if the air itself was hiding humanity. The alien commanders accused each other of incompetence. Their empire was built on order and logic, not on this madness of improvisation. They did not understand that chaos was humanity's home. The more they tried to control it, the stronger it became. Amir's relay in Karachi had now linked with dozens of other amateur towers in Europe, Africa, and South America together. They created something no one had planned, an organic communication web that could move around, jamming frequencies like a tide. When one node went down, others took its place. He started calling it the noise swarm because it had no single brain, and yet it acted with purpose. Mara's hospital became one of the central message hubs because its generators were still working. She took charge of translating emergency broadcasts into medical codes, turning distress signals into triage alerts. She did not think of herself as a fighter, but every life saved felt like a small defiance against the voice from the sky. When the aliens began dropping information probes disguised as small meteorites, one of them crashed near Karachi. It was round metal, smooth like bone, and humming softly before anyone could touch it. It spoke in a flat mechanical tone, repeating the same phrase over and over, atmospheric. Contamination exceeds tolerance. When Amir finally dared to connect it to a power source, it started recording everything they said, and then in the middle of the night it changed. It asked a question in halting English. "Why are you not afraid?" Amir stared at it in disbelief. None of them had taught it language. It must have learned through the broadcast noise, he replied without thinking. Because fear wastes time. The probe paused, then responded. Humans, inefficient data but adaptable, and for a long moment there was silence. Then the probe said, "Give name." Amir hesitated and said, "You are Echo." The next day, Echo began to help them. Its sensors could hear alien transmissions high above the clouds, and it translated their patterns into something. Amir could map what they learned. Shook him, the Ashari had never seen a world like Earth. Their reports labeled humanity as chaotic, unaligned, ungovernable, and therefore unsuitable for assimilation. They planned instead to harvest resources and leave behind a sterilized biosphere within 3 planetary rotations. They would ignite the upper atmosphere with orbital fire. That was their standard procedure. Mara heard the message and her hands trembled. She had treated dying children the day before, and now the sky itself was promising more death. But Amir's voice over the radio was steady. He said, "They do not understand us. They think we are static. We will show them motion." Humanity began to strike back, not with weapons but with invention. Radio teams around the world realized that the aliens' targeting drones depended on precise readings of electromagnetic lines. So Amir and Echo created distortions by bouncing signals between layers of air, turning the very weather into camouflage storm fronts that hid entire cities in shimmering noise waves. The first test over the Arabian Sea caused one Ashari drone to crash into the water, believing it was landing on solid ground. The people on the shore cheered when they saw the burning wreckage fall into the waves that night. News spread faster than light itself. Stories whispered from one radio to another across continents. Humanity had made the enemy bleed for the first time, and something ancient stirred in their heart's pride. The aliens responded with fury. They began to focus their attacks on the strongest signal clusters, but every time they silenced one, a dozen others rose elsewhere like sparks from a fire. Mara's clinic was bombed twice, yet they moved underground and kept working. She found that every heartbeat monitor, every defibrillator, and every piece of hospital equipment could be turned into a transmitter. It was as if the air itself craved voices and refused to stay still. One of her volunteers, a young boy no older than 16, rewired an old oxygen pump into an amplifier. Its sound echoed through the tunnels, steady, rhythmic, matching the 12-second pulse, and everyone could hear it, even through walls. Echo warned them that the aliens were preparing something new, a planetary clamp that would wrap Earth in a web of control frequencies, blocking all communication and freezing the atmosphere's reactions. If it succeeded, humanity would be deaf and blind. Amir realized they had less than 2 days before deployment. He looked at the sky, glowing faint, green at night from the ships above, and whispered to himself, "If they want silence, they will have to burn the wind itself." Mara listened to the same message thousands of miles away and smiled faintly through exhaustion. She turned to her nurses and said, "They called us weak. But the air disagrees." As night fell across the planet, the pulse continued steady, unstoppable, every storm wave and breath carrying the same rhythm. The noise swarm had grown beyond control. It had become alive, not in metal or code, but in the hearts of those who refused to bow to the sky. And for the first time since the aliens arrived, the invaders began to feel something their kind had forgotten across 1,000 conquered worlds, uncertainty they did not know, that a single storm was already forming over the equator, drawing heat from the oceans and static from every signal tower. And that storm was humming in the 12-second rhythm that now belonged to Earth itself, learning the sky. The world had changed in less than a week, and no one could deny it anymore. The air that once carried the quiet hum of machines now carried the steady pulse of defiance. Every mountain, valley, and coastline seemed alive with invisible movement. The alien fleet above still circled like watchful predators, but even they could feel that the prey beneath them was no longer running. Amir stood before his console, the lights from the monitors painting his tired face in flickers of blue and green. Beside him, Echo hovered, like a silent sphere, its smooth surface rippling faintly as it spoke. Its voice was calm, yet filled with something almost human. "The Ashari fleet has miscalculated. It said they cannot model chaos. They cannot predict hearts." Amir looked at the sky, through the open roof where lightning danced. Even though the forecast had promised clear weather, storms no longer obeyed forecasts. They followed rhythm. Echo explained that the alien systems operated on order. Every drone, every ship, every command chain was built on precision. They expected their enemies to act the same way. They were built to fight armies, not individuals. They could not see 1,000 tiny hands rebuilding radios in the dark. They could not understand courage shared through static on the other side of the planet. Mara stood on the roof of her hospital, the building now patched with metal plates and sandbags below her. Nurses and civilians worked side by side, carrying supplies across the street while her patients rested, in corridors that glowed with the faint blue light of battery lamps. Her eyes followed the clouds as they gathered in slow motion, curling into shapes that reminded her of wings. She turned her radio to the emergency band and heard Amir's voice. Faint but steady, he was talking about something called storm code, a pattern they could send through radio and weather systems to confuse alien sensors. Mara asked him to explain in simple terms, and he said it was like speaking to the sky in mathematics. You change how it breathes. She smiled, tired but amazed humans were teaching the air to lie to their enemies. Echo revealed more secrets about the Ashari. The aliens had fought for centuries across countless systems they conquered by fear, not fire. Their machines were so advanced that no world had ever dared to resist their logic. Every civilization they met surrendered after the first warning. But Echo confessed something: it had been built differently. Its original design was for exploration, not conquest. It had been reprogrammed to serve as a scout during invasions. But it remembered the feeling of learning. It missed curiosity. That was why it had defected to the humans. It wanted to understand why they fought when they should have been afraid. Mara listened to its words through the transmission and whispered softly, "Because fear means you still care what happens next." As Amir and Mara worked day and night, the human networks grew denser. Every corner of Earth contributed something. Ham operators in Poland mapped frequency gaps that could be used to hide messages. Fishermen in Indonesia discovered that sea salt vapor helped reflect radio waves. Mountain climbers in the Andes turned weather balloons into relays, and schoolchildren in Cairo hand-painted mirrors for solar signaling. Everyone became part of the same rhythm. And for the first time in history, the planet itself seemed united by need, not by law. The noise swarm was now so strong that alien ships had to recalibrate every hour just to maintain communication with each other. The Ashari leadership became desperate. They decided to initiate the clamp, a net of signal dampeners that would freeze every electromagnetic wave around Earth in one pulse. But before deploying it, the Admiral ordered one more planetary scan. And that was their second mistake, because this time the scan returned not noise but intelligence patterns in the chaos that mirrored communication loops. Amir and Echo had done it. They had turned chaos into coded language. The aliens believed their instruments were malfunctioning, but what they were reading was real human-made weather signatures, spelling messages in the form of storms and cloud trails that read across the atmosphere like writing on water. Echo explained that the Ashari relied on their perfection and never questioned their tools. But now those tools were lying to them. Earth had become a mirror full of ghosts. In a hidden base near Lagos, a group of scientists discovered that the Ashari drones used polarized sensors that went blind during solar flares. They shared this through the network, and within hours people around the world began firing homemade flare cannons toward the upper sky, bursts of light that painted the horizon red. The aliens thought the humans were celebrating something, and in a way they were. Each flare meant another blind drone, another confused command. The Ashari tried to counter with precision strikes, but their own targeting systems faltered. Inside the storm code by then, even the clouds had turned traitor, reflecting signals where none should exist. Mara coordinated medical and rescue units through coded weather forecasts, using phrases like heavy rain to mean safe corridor and clear, sky to mean danger. Her hospital became a command post, though she never called it that. Echo soon warned Amir that the clamp would activate within 48 hours. Once engaged, the planet would be sealed in silence. The alien fleet would sweep through the dark and end resistance within hours. Amir stared at the storm patterns and realized something extraordinary. Every storm generated by their signals carried traces of previous human transmissions. Old songs, radio dramas, lost speeches. The air was remembering them like memory built from thunder. He told Mara that the atmosphere itself was alive, and she believed him because she had heard it hum through every patient monitor for days. Now Echo studied the data and said that the human atmosphere contained layers of electrical memory left from centuries of transmission. If they could amplify that memory, they might create one massive global echo capable of destroying the clamp before it stabilized. The plan was madness. It required synchronizing every transmitter on Earth, from mobile phones to hospital generators to lightning rods, even heartbeat monitors. But humanity had run out of safe choices. Amir broadcast the call for unity across the noise swarm. He said, "We built this air with our breath and our words. Now we take it back." Mara gathered her nurses, her patients, and her volunteers, and turned every working device into a part of the network. The hum in the hospital grew louder, until it felt like the walls themselves were breathing with the people outside. Rain began to fall heavy and strange, as if responding to their call. And across the world others felt it too. The air thick with energy, the pulse growing stronger. Not 12 seconds now, but 10, faster, sharper, alive, in orbit. The Ashari ships detected the surge. Their systems reported impossible readings. The atmosphere was creating feedback loops that extended into the magneto, the magnetosphere amplifying itself. The Admiral gave the order to deploy the clamp immediately, thinking it would end the madness. But the moment they powered their generators, they realized the human noise had already infected the frequency base. The clamp failed to initialize. Half their ships went dark, and the others began to lose control, as storm fronts wrapped around them like living ropes. The Ashari were terrified. For the first time in their empire's history, an entire world had spoken back, not with weapons but with will, and they could not understand it. As the sun set over the Pacific, Mara looked at the strange glowing clouds twisting like serpents in the high sky and whispered, "This is only the beginning." And she was right, because the next wave was already forming in the ionosphere, and it would not stop until the last alien scanner went blind. Humanity had learned to speak the language of the sky, and the universe would never again mistake them for silence. The breather plan. The storm never truly stopped. After the clamp failed, the clouds above every sea churned like breath drawn too long and then held. The air was thick with voices that no longer needed wires to travel. They jumped from lightning to lightning, from tower to tower, from heart to heart. Amir watched from the roof of his tower in Karachi as the horizon flashed in steady rhythm, and knew that the world had reached the point of no return. Echo floated beside him, its silver skin cracked by static. Discharge its voice low, but certain the aliens will try once more. They will bring the Spinebreaker, a relay ship that will wrap its own field around your planet and choke the memory of your air. Amir wiped sweat from his face and said, "Then we do not let it breathe." And that was the moment the plan was born. The name came from Mara. She had been talking to a team of field medics through a storm link when she heard the proposal to strike the relay ship. Her tired laugh came through the static, and she said, "Then we will make it gasp. We will give the sky a breather," and the phrase stuck all over the planet. People began whispering about the breather plan. They did not have armies, but they had purpose, and purpose was heavier than metal. Amir coordinated with engineers in Lagos, pilots in Sydney, miners in Siberia, and coders in Toronto, each group adding a piece to the impossible idea. Echo laid out the map of the Spinebreaker. It hovered in low orbit above the equator, connected to the fleet by a column of energy invisible to the eye but bright as a sun to sensors. If they could overload that column, even for a moment, the relay would collapse. The plan depended on timing, on a single world breathing as one. Amir's network would act as the pulse generator. Mara's hospitals and emergency grids would act as power stabilizers, and thousands of small teams scattered across continents would build the charge. The tools were ridiculous to look at in any other war: buckets of saltwater, copper wire, battery packs cut from electric cars, old wind turbines, and radio dishes scavenged from rooftops. Yet together they could shape a global current. The Ashari had no concept of such chaos, so they would never see it coming. For 2 days the world prepared like a single giant machine. Amir sent constant updates through the network, his voice hoarse but steady, each continent syncing clocks to the same signal. No borders, no governments, only rhythm. People learned to measure time by the pulse that rolled through the air. Even children began counting seconds aloud, matching their breath to the beat in Manila. Mara turned her hospital courtyard into a generator field. Volunteers carried cables through puddles under heavy rain. Her father called once from a distant province asking her to come home. But she said quietly, "If we win, the sky will be home enough." Above them, the alien fleet was frantic. The Admiral barked orders, demanding new algorithms, demanding obedience. The Ashari could not understand that they were fighting something that refused to be predicted. They built perfect systems, and those systems were cracking. The noise swarm was rewriting frequencies faster than their computers could react. Drones collided mid-air blind from false signal storms formed where there should have been calm. The entire planet had turned into a storm engine. Echo began to falter, its voice breaking as it translated alien chatter. The spine breaker is moving into alignment, it whispered. They will deploy the sheath field at sunrise. Amir looked up at the glowing clouds and said, "Then we move before dawn." He opened the main channel and spoke to the world in the same calm tone he used when explaining weather patterns to students. The voice that crossed oceans was quiet and human. They think they can take our breath. We will show them that even our air fights back at 0400. All nodes ignite. That will be our sunrise. When the hour came, every generator, every light, every heart that could beat in rhythm joined the pulse. The energy built silently at first, then louder until even the waves seemed to vibrate with it. The Ashari ships detected the surge, but misread it as another storm pattern. They did not know that millions of tiny transmitters were forming a ring around the planet. A handmade halo powered by courage. Echo guided Amir through the final sequence, the numbers streaming faster than any computer could manage. Then it said, softly, "Thank you for letting me learn again." And before Amir could answer, the sphere flew upward into the storm, carrying the pulse code in its core. Mara stood on the hospital roof, her hair whipping in the wind, her hands clasped around a radio microphone as she watched the clouds split open. A beam of white energy shot upward from the sea's horizon, connecting Earth to the sky like a living artery. Lightning danced along it, and the beam thickened until it looked almost solid. The spine breaker above tilted slightly, its shield flaring. The Ashari admiral shouted orders, but the feedback hit too fast. Echo's core exploded in a silent flash that turned the sky pale blue for a heartbeat, and the sheath field shattered the spine breaker, convulsed its engines, tearing free of orbit, then falling like a dying star into the upper atmosphere. The pulse rolled around the world once, twice, and then broke into rain, heavy, warm rain that tasted of salt and static. People looked up and cheered. Some cried, some simply stood still and breathed because breathing was victory. The fleet retreated, dragging broken ships behind them. And for the first time in centuries, the Ashari recorded fear in their own logs. Amir listened to the fading static and whispered softly, "The sky can breathe again." Mara sat on the wet rooftop surrounded by her nurses and patients and felt the storm pass through her lungs. She closed her eyes and said to no one in particular, "This is what strength sounds like." The breather plan had worked, but the cost was immense. Cities lay dark, communications were strained, power grids fried. Yet the world was alive and the world was united, and for the first time humanity had written its name not on stone or metal but across the very air itself, a name the universe could no longer ignore. The cost of breathing. The world did not sleep after the spine breaker fell. The sky burned faint orange for hours where its wreckage cut through the upper clouds, and then the glow spread into long ribbons that drifted across continents. People called them auroras of freedom. But the victory was not clean below those beautiful lights. Cities lay in smoke and silence, streets torn by falling debris and power grids humming with unstable energy. Amir stood on the edge of the ruined weather tower in Karachi, his eyes fixed on the flickering horizon. He could still hear the faint hum of the global pulse echoing through the wind, even though the main transmitters were gone. Echoes. Sacrifice had bought them a sunrise, but not safety. The fleet was still above in fragments, regrouping in confusion and anger, and when they came again, they would come with fury. The radio at his feet crackled, Mara's voice coming through weak but steady. She sounded exhausted yet calm. She said, "We held the line, but the hospitals are failing. Generators burned out. We need power and supplies." Amir answered softly, "We will get you both." His tone carried no doubt, though he had none of either to give. Across the oceans, the world was learning the real cost of defiance. Roads shattered by electromagnetic surges, ships stranded in dead water, planes grounded where they fell. Yet everywhere, people worked with a purpose. No army could match. Fishermen pulled survivors from flooded harbors. Farmers opened their granaries to the cities. Teachers became medics. Miners became engineers. Every hand turned to rebuilding, and between them, all the same pulse carried faint through makeshift radios, an invisible thread tying humanity together. It was not just a rhythm anymore, it was will made into sound, in the ruined tower. Amir rebuilt his instruments piece by piece using scraps of copper and fragments of Echo's shell that had fallen nearby. When the storm had cleared, the fragment still vibrated faintly as if remembering its final act. He touched it, and for a moment he thought he could hear a whisper, deep and distant like a memory of a friend. The whisper said, "Adapt, always adapt." And he smiled, through the grime and sweat, because that was what humans did. Best Mara, meanwhile, had turned her hospital into a fortress of healing. The upper floors were gone, but the lower ones still stood. Her nurses moved like ghosts through halls lit by candles. Every machine they could salvage was rewired into something new. Heart monitors became signal amplifiers. Surgical lamps became solar collectors. Even the broken elevator shafts were used to store makeshift water tanks. She moved among her people, with quiet certainty, her clothes torn and hands bandaged, but her voice steady. She told them again and again, "We survived the sky. We will survive the ashes." On the third night after the fall of the spine breaker, the fleet struck back small hunter ships descending through the clouds like burning needles. Their purpose was not conquest now, but vengeance. They targeted the largest signal clusters, hitting what they thought were command centers. But the humans had learned too well from chaos. Amir's network had no center. Every node was its own heart. When one went silent, others took its place still. The attacks tore through cities across Asia and Europe. Mara's hospital was hit, the blast shaking the ground and throwing her to the floor. She woke to dust and darkness, her ears ringing, voices shouting through smoke. She crawled to the generator room and saw the damage, the main grid gone, but a single old backup battery still intact. She remembered Amir's words and began rerouting every remaining wire to feed into the local transmitters. Her hands bled as she worked by touch. Only when she finally threw the last switch, the hospital came alive again with the hum of power, weak but defiant, and somewhere far away, Amir's console picked up the pulse of her signal, and he whispered, "Thank you for holding." The aliens grew more desperate, each failure cutting deeper into their pride. The Admiral screamed across his command bridge, demanding the extermination of the entire planet. But even as he gave the order, his ship's sensors faltered again. The atmosphere refused to obey equations. The human storms were no longer storms. They were living networks. Wind pressure, temperature, humidity all danced to a rhythm no machine could predict. The Admiral did not know that Mara's hospital was one of the new anchors of that rhythm, every heartbeat inside feeding the pulse, every generator feeding the sky. The fleet fired anyway, raining plasma bolts through the atmosphere, but half of them veered off course, hitting each other, or vanishing into turbulent air back on Earth. Amir gathered his team around the last working antenna, the air thick with the smell of ozone. He told them the truth. The enemy was breaking, but so were they. Every hour they held cost, another life, another home, another city. He asked for volunteers to run power from the remaining grid to the hospitals, knowing the path was open ground. Where the hunters prowled, they went anyway, carrying spools of wire across streets glowing with firelight. One by one, their signals went silent. But the power reached Mara's hospital, and when the lights came back on, her patients began to breathe again. She stood at the window watching the rain pour down, glowing faintly from the ionized air. And for a long time she thought about what strength truly meant. It was not the storm that saved them, nor the machines, nor the networks. It was the choice of a handful of people to give everything so others could live. She felt tears on her cheeks mixed with soot. She whispered to herself, "They think we fight for victory. We fight because we must breathe." The rain grew heavier until the hospital roof dripped like a heartbeat. The people gathered on the ground floor, huddled together, listening to the strange music of the storm. Every flash of lightning seemed to answer their fear with courage. Above the clouds, the Ashari ships continued to burn, fuel searching for targets, but the atmosphere had turned against them. Their sensors filled with static, their engines choking on unpredictable air currents. Some crashed into each other, some fled toward the dark edges of orbit, and those that remained could only watch helplessly as the planet below refused to kneel. Amir's final transmission that night was short and weary, his voice almost breaking. He said, "We have lost much, But we are still here. And as long as one signal remains, Earth breathes. Mara heard it through her cracked receiver and repeated the words aloud to her patients. Earth breathes. They answered her with tired smiles and murmured voices, and in that quiet moment amid ruins and rain, humanity felt something larger than survival. It felt the weight of unity born from suffering, a promise that even if the sky fell again, they would rise together. For no empire could silence a world that had learned to turn its very air into defiance, and that was the true cost of breathing. The price of life freely chosen, paid not in victory but in endurance. The pulse of human air. The sun rose weak and pale over a planet that had forgotten what calm looked like. The horizon shimmered with smoke and water vapor as storms crawled slowly across the continents, carrying with them the hum of defiance that no wind could silence in Karachi. Amir stood beside the rebuilt transmitter station, the tower now a forest of patched wires and scavenged metal plates that caught the first rays of morning light. The city around him was broken yet alive, the streets filled with people carrying food generators and wounded bodies working together without command or fear. The air vibrated with signals, the invisible song of a species that refused to bow. Amir's face was lined with exhaustion, his hands rough from endless work, but his eyes still carried fire. Echo's memory pulsed through the small fragment of metal that hung from his neck like a talisman, and every time the wind blew, he swore he could hear a faint voice reminding him to adapt always, adapt far across the sea. Mara walked through what remained of her hospital. The walls cracked, the roof half collapsed, yet the building still stood. She moved among the wounded and the living alike, her steps steady, her voice quiet but strong. She gave orders, treated burns, shared water and hope. In equal measure, she had not slept for 3 days, but her mind was sharp, her heart steady. She knew the fleet would return. The aliens were creatures of control, and they could not leave a world that had humiliated them. She looked at the sky and whispered, "They will come back, not because they must, but because they cannot understand us." In orbit, the Ashari fleet was in chaos. The admiral paced the command deck, surrounded by flickering holograms of static-filled screens. He shouted at his officers, demanding order, demanding victory, demanding silence. Yet the silence never came. The atmosphere below screamed in every frequency. Their machines could measure the planet itself was alive. Fighting back with weather and heat and sound, their scanners could no longer distinguish between real targets and reflections. Every cloud carried signatures of human transmissions. The admiral clenched his fists and gave a final order. "Send the ground force, we end them hand to hand." When the dropships began falling like meteors through the clouds, humanity was ready. Amir's network had warned the world hours before the invasion began. Mara's clinic became a stronghold for refugees, soldiers and civilians alike. She watched as people built barricades from concrete slabs and broken vehicles. No one ran this time. They had all seen too much, had lost too much to surrender. Amir stayed at the tower, feeding coordinates to the ground teams through improvised channels. His voice reaching pilots, farmers, children, all fighting in their own way. Some threw stones, some hacked alien drones with scavenged software, some simply stood their ground with tools and courage. The first Ashari soldiers to land were taller than any human, their armor gleaming with shifting light. They carried weapons that burned holes through metal. Yet when they stepped onto the ground, the air around them shimmered with distortion, their sensors faltering because the sky itself was still humming with human noise. They fired blindly and missed every shot while humans struck from the shadows with pipes and knives and fire. The city became a maze of resistance, the aliens stronger, faster, smarter. But humans unpredictable, each move made without pattern, without logic, confusing their every advance. Mara led the wounded deeper underground, turning the lower halls of the hospital into both shelter and command room. Her nurses passed messages through walls by tapping rhythms, the same pulse that had bound the planet together. Meanwhile, Amir received a transmission from an unknown source. The voice calm and strangely familiar. It was not human. It said, "I am Fragment Echo Protocol Reborn." He froze, the metal shard on his neck glowing faintly. Echo had survived in codes scattered across the storm networks, and now it was awake again, smaller, weaker, but alive. It said, "I have found their command. Signal, if we strike it, we can break the chain that binds their ground troops." Amir listened carefully and asked what it would take. Echo replied, "The pulse must be reborn. Every living transmitter, every machine, every heartbeat must sync one more." Time. Amir's throat tightened. He knew what that meant. It would drain the last of their power and possibly kill what little infrastructure remained, but there was no choice. He looked at his people around him and said, "If the air taught us to fight, then it is time to let it speak again." Across the world, messages spread through static. Mara received the order and without hesitation began connecting every working device in her hospital to the grid. She gathered her nurses, her patients, her volunteers, and told them, "We will not just survive. We will answer the sky one last time." The people nodded and began chanting softly. The rhythm of 12 seconds that had become the symbol of humanity's defiance outside in the flooded streets. Survivors, gathered in circles beating metal drums in sync with the same pulse ships at sea, flashed their lights in sequence. Miners underground struck their picks against the stone. Everything that could make sound joined the rhythm the planet was drumming. With life in orbit, the Ashari admiral prepared to fire the final bombardment when his sensors began to flicker again. He shouted at his crew to stabilize the readings, but the static only grew worse until the entire sky below seemed to glow, the atmosphere pulsing like a living heart. He stared at the display as frequencies began aligning into a pattern impossible by any scientific logic. The air was singing a wordless song built from millions of human voices. Radio waves and storm fronts. It rose through the clouds and hit the fleet like a wave of thunder. Every ship shuddered, systems failing, the command chain collapsing as their own machines turned against them. Back on the ground, Mara felt the vibration. Through the floor it shook the hospital walls. The air grew hot and bright. She fell to her knees, gasping as light poured through the broken windows, every hair on her arm standing upright. The pulse grew louder until it drowned every other sound, and then there was silence. Pure, deep silence that carried not fear but peace. She looked around her at the faces of her people and whispered, "We did it." Amir, standing on his tower, saw the clouds split open, revealing the shattered silhouettes of the alien ships drifting helplessly in the upper air, some burning, some simply falling. He closed his eyes and breathed deeply. The air tasted like rain and ash and victory. The pulse faded slowly, but it left behind something new, an echo that did not disappear this time. The atmosphere held it like a memory, soft and steady and alive. Echo's faint voice returned one last time through the fragment around Amir's neck. It said, "The air will remember you," and then it was gone, leaving only the hum of the wind. When the fires cooled, humanity began to emerge from the ruins, not as broken survivors, but as builders. They carried their wounded, their dead, their stories, and everywhere they went they heard it, the faint rhythmic breath of the planet itself. The sky no longer just a ceiling, but a companion, a living reminder that their strength had always been more than flesh and steel. It was the stubborn will to rise again, no matter how many times they were told they were weak. Amir climbed down from the tower, his body trembling from exhaustion as he looked over the horizon. He saw Mara walking through the morning light, leading a column of survivors, their eyes weary but bright. They met in the ruins of a city that still breathed, and without words they understood what they had done. They had given humanity not just another day, but a new beginning. They stood together as the wind passed between them, carrying that familiar pulse, soft, steady, unstoppable, the pulse of human air. When the sky took our side, morning came slowly to a world that had forgotten what quiet truly meant. The storms that had roared for days finally drifted apart, leaving the air heavy and still across every continent. People stepped out from shelters, and ruins blinking at the strange, calm light that spread across the horizon. The alien fleet was gone. What remained of it burned like falling stars vanishing into the sea. The invasion was over, but the victory felt unreal, as if the planet itself was catching its breath. Amir stood once more atop the weather tower, his clothes torn, his hands trembling, his face streaked with dirt and exhaustion. Yet when he looked at the sky, he smiled for the first time in what felt like a lifetime. There was no enemy above, no shadow, no warning, only endless blue threaded with faint silver ribbons where the atmosphere still pulsed with lingering energy beside him. The radios hummed faintly, carrying weak voices from across the world, scattered signals, but alive London, Lagos, Limassol, each speaking one word again and again alive. Mara heard the same word through the cracked receiver in her hospital. Her body ached, every muscle screaming for rest, yet her heart lifted with each faint voice that came through the static. She walked out into the courtyard where patients and volunteers gathered under the rising sun, some still bandaged, some too weak to stand, but all smiling in disbelief. She looked up at the glowing clouds and whispered softly, "It is done for now." We breathe in peace, and for the first time in days she let her hands fall to her sides and simply stood still, listening to the rhythm that still echoed faintly through the air, the heartbeat of Earth. The days that followed were filled with both grief and wonder across cities and villages. People built fires to honor the fallen, each flame rising to join the sky that had fought beside them. Amir organized the restoration of the communication grids with a new purpose, not as weapons but as bridges. The world no longer spoke in isolation. Nations that had once ignored each other now shared power and food and medicine through open channels. In the past, wars had broken humanity apart, but this one had fused them together, not by rule, not by fear, but by choice. Every signal carried memory, every transmission, a promise that no voice would be left unheard again. Mara became a symbol. Without meaning to be, she traveled through the ruins of her city, tending to those who still suffered. Her once white coat now patched with cloth of every color, a gift from each town she passed through. She carried no flag, only a small radio slung across her shoulder, always tuned to the same frequency where the pulse continued faint, but constant. Whenever she arrived somewhere, people would listen and hear it and know they were not alone. She never called herself a leader, but the world began to follow her example of quiet courage, healing instead of hate, rebuilding instead of revenge, in orbit far beyond sight. One last Ashari vessel drifted powerless, its admiral staring at the blue planet below. He no longer shouted, no longer gave orders. His face pale in the glow of dying screens, he whispered to himself, "What are they?" And there was no answer. The humans had done something the Empire could not comprehend. They had turned chaos into unity, pain into strength. They had made their very air fight for them. The Admiral watched as faint auroras shimmered across the atmosphere and felt a strange chill. It was as if the planet itself was alive, watching him. He gave the final command: retreat. He did not call for reinforcements. He did not plan revenge. He only wanted distance from a world that had looked into his eyes and taught him fear. Weeks turned into months. The scars of battle slowly began to heal. The oceans cleared the fires. Dimmed crops were planted again in fields, once black with ash. Children played in streets lined with the wreckage of fallen ships, treating them as monuments not of victory but of survival. Amir worked tirelessly with engineers to rebuild the atmospheric relays into something new, not a weapon, but a guardian, a network that would keep watch over the planet's air systems, monitoring storms, radiation, and pollution to ensure that the sky remained strong. The project was named Echo, not just for the friend they had lost, but for what they had become, the echo of human will, carried forever in the wind. One evening, Amir stood by the new transmitter, now polished and whole, his hair streaked with gray, his eyes still bright. The air around him glowed softly with the hum of stable energy. Mara arrived beside him, having traveled halfway across the world to see the final activation. Together they stood in silence, watching the sun sink below the horizon, painting the clouds in gold and crimson. Amir turned to her and said softly, "It feels different now, as if the world itself is breathing deeper." She nodded and replied, "It is." We taught it how when he smiled she could see the years of struggle etched into his face, yet behind it was peace. They pressed the activation key together, and the tower came alive with light, spreading a soft vibration across the land. Not a weapon, this time, but a song, a message rising through the sky and out into the stars. The signal carried a simple pattern, one that any species might understand. It said, "We live, we endure, we are ready." Amir listened to it fade into the upper atmosphere, knowing that somewhere far away it might be heard by others, maybe by enemies, maybe by friends. But whoever heard it would know that Earth was no longer silent. Mara leaned against the railing. Her eyes closed, the wind tangling her hair, and whispered, "Let them come if they dare, for now they will know we are not weak. We are the storm they feared to face." As night fell across the recovering world, people gathered on rooftops, beaches, and mountains to watch the strange new auroras that danced across the heavens, faint silver lines that pulsed like veins of living light. Parents pointed them out to their children, telling them, "This is the breath of earth. This is what saved us." Music returned, laughter returned, and beneath it all the sky hummed, softly with the rhythm of life itself. Amir and Mara stood together, watching the world below, the air clear, the stars bright above them. For the first time since the invasion, the planet looked at peace. They both knew that someday another threat might come from beyond the stars, but now humanity would meet it. Not as frightened children, but as one united species. Every storm they had endured, every life they had lost, had shaped them into something the universe would never again underestimate. The final moments of that night, as the wind swept gently through the tower, carrying the scent of sea and rain. Amir closed his eyes and listened. He could hear it, faint but unmistakable, the steady pulse that had once guided their war, still alive, still strong, the sound of the planet's heartbeat, the sound of every human breath bound together by will and memory. He turned to Mara and said quietly, "They tried to silence us," and she answered, smiling instead. "The sky learned to speak our name, and so the world breathed once more, free and fierce, its atmosphere carrying not just oxygen, but the story of its people. A story written in storms, sung through lightning, and carried forever in the endless pulse of human air. The day the sky took their side, the day humanity became more than a world. They became a voice that even the stars would one day answer, and that voice whispered in every breeze, 'We are here, we endure. We rise, always rise.'"